Next, let us talk about the methods to identify the significant impacts and priority settings. There are various methods available. Each has its own advantages and disadvantages. The selections of the methods will be dependent on the situations as well as the strategies for conducting the EIA studies. One of the common methods will be the EIA matrix. However, the samples given in the guideline has poor resolutions. It is unclear, especially on the descriptions of the matrix. You may search for the examples of EIA matrix from the internet. This is one of the examples that I obtained from the internet. Basically, it comprises two components. First is the project activities. Second, it will be the environmental components. The project activities may be divided into different stages as identified from the master work program, and the relevant list of the activities may be outlined. The purpose here to describe the project activities is to check the project activities against the environmental components. This may include the air environment, soil environment, surface groundwater environment, noise environment, biological environments, human and social economy environment, and etc., whichever deems to be relevant. For every single project activities, there shall be rating against the environmental components. There may be codings specified to provide informations in terms of the types of the impacts, whether it is positive impacts or negative impacts, as well as the degree of impacts, whether it is major impact or minor impacts. Based on the descriptions listed here, it is coded by using numbers and alphabets. Number 1 represents minor adverse impacts. That means the impacts is relatively small and it is a negative impact. Number 2 is moderate adverse impact. Number 3, it will be the major adverse impacts. As for A and B represent the positive impacts. One is minor, another one is major. There may be uncertainty in terms of the impacts. For example, as specified by the U here, potentially adverse but insufficient information. That means the relevant project activities might give adverse impacts, but at the moment it is still uncertain and lacking sufficient information. And then N here represent insignificant impacts. Now let us talk about how to read this EIA matrix. Taking the first project activities here, this is related to the investigation stage. That means before the commencement of the project works. The investigations is checked against the environmental components. It seems that most of the impacts are relatively small and negligible. Now let us look at another project activities. This project is related to logging. Therefore, this EIA matrix is conducted to assess the impacts of the logging process. As identified here, logging of trees. The impacts of these activities is evaluated against the environmental components. The impacts are small and moderate for the air atmosphere. It imposes some adverse significant impacts to the soil, surface and groundwater environment. particularly in terms of the water qualities, some of the drainage, soil erosions, and also biological environments. Now, based on the EIA matrix here, we are able to identify the significance of the project activities, and the priority can be given to whichever is relatively significant. Also, there are cases where the project activities brings positive impacts. For example, the rehabilitations after the logging works, such as clearing and disposals of debris, that can bring positive impacts to the land use. It seems that the EIA matrix can be detailed enough to cover the social economics. Now, these project activities can bring benefit to the short-term and long-term employment. And what you see here, this kind of assessment can be quite neutral, representing the conditions, both the positive and negative impacts of a development project, which is refined into various project activities, as well as thoroughly checked against various environmental components. By reading the EIA matrix, we can decide the priority for the mitigation measures. We can also decide worthiness of the project, whether the benefits that we intend to acquire can compensate the negative impacts of the relevant project. We have another examples of the EIA matrix. This one is less refined. It identifies in terms of the three categories: negative effect, no effect, and beneficial effects, or qualitatively identify the impacts of the project activities against the environmental components. This is another method which is known as the Leopard matrix. This represents quantitative measures to determine the degree of magnitudes and the significance. The magnitudes here represent the degree of the impacts due to the project activities against the environmental component, whereas the significance defines the levels of significance of the impacts to the society. According to the description here, they are in the scale of 1 to 10 for both magnitude and significance. The larger the number represent the higher degree of the magnitudes and the significance. This is another example of the EIA matrix. It is basically used to evaluate the project activities against the environmental components, except that the coding system now is represented by the color code instead of having numbers or alphabet to represent them. The classifications also vary slightly, which in this example here, there is a clearer definition in terms of the levels of impacts. White color means that insignificant and excluded from the matrix. Blue color means that the environmental impact that is potentially but on temporary basis, and we assume equilibrium after a certain period of time. Next, environmental impact that is potentially significant, but which there is insignificant data to make a reliable predictions. Close monitoring and control is recommended. Yellow color, potentially significant adverse environmental impact for which a design solutions has been identified. Green color, residual and significant adverse environmental impacts. and then significant environmental enhancement. Now you may want to ask, among the methods introduced, which one is better? When the formats are similar, the principles are similar. Now it is based on the information to be carried by the EIA matrix, which varied slightly. It depends the stages of your project, as well as the purpose of doing this EIA matrix. At the early stage of the EIA study, when you are doing scoping, you are more interested in identifying the potential impacts for you to determine the priority so that P2M2 can be carried out. P2M2 stands for pollution prevention and mitigation measures. Now, since you're only interested with the priority in terms of the potential impacts, then you may choose the classifications whichever relevant to the objective. Probably now your focus here is to identify whether it is adverse impacts or positive impacts. Having those identified, you might want to know the levels of impact, whether it is minor or major. And there may be some impacts seems to be potential but lacking information or evidence. Then you may need another classifications. Therefore, this list of classifications may be applicable. However, if your EIA studies has come to the later stage, which you have already constructed your terms of references, knowing the scope of the EIA study, as well as the focus of the studies, having the significant impacts identified, you are heading towards next process to have some quantifications in terms of the levels of the impacts, whether it is significant enough to trigger mitigation measures, or for you to carry additional informations, which project activities comes with the mitigation measures. Then the relevant informations can be incorporated within the definitions of different indications. For example here, close monitoring and control is recommended. A design solutions has been identified. Sometimes you may have the intention to compare two construction methods in order to objectively evaluate the effectiveness of those construction methods as an effort to preserve the environment. And the outcome of this is for you to choose the best method to be adopted for the development project. The EIA matrix may be used for the comparison purposes. When you have more than one options to decide, choose whichever is more effective and practical. Now, regarding the coding system, there is no standard format. Numbers and alphabet may be used. Color code may also be used. Using the color code may be graphically pleasant, which can help you quickly identify the critical components. However, if you are looking into the discrete elements, you might need to constantly check with the definitions of the color code. When it involves more classifications, now the color coding system may not be as user-friendly, and the contrast of the color may also be an issue, which may result in misinterpretations of the levels of significance. Alternatively, you may use the numbers and alphabet coding system. This helps you to identify every single component. By having a glance, you will know the definitions and their classifications. Except that those require emphasis and attention, such as the major adverse impacts, may not obviously stand out of those coding systems. Ultimately, it will be depending on your preferences in terms of the coding system. To make it simple, there is no standard format for the EIA matrix. The fundamental principles here, it will be checking of the project activities against various environmental components for a thorough analysis in order to identify the potential impacts due to a project. The classifications shall be determined on basis of the purpose of the EIA matrix. Whether the ultimate goal is just to identify the potential impacts, or you would like to go one step further to rate the levels of the impacts, or maybe another step further to indicate the P2 and N2 measures that are to be considered or implemented against the respective project activities. As for the coding system, it will be very much dependent on your personal preference, whether you like it to be in numbered, in alphabet, or in color coding system.